I would say since it's 7 p.m., let's go ahead and start. And I know people are still going to be entering throughout, but I do want to give each speaker their due time. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, who's the chair for this session.
Thank you, Saba. And I'm just going to take a very quick moment to add my thanks to the thanks that people have been giving all day long to the organizers and to all our presenters, that this has been a wonderful, wonderful conference day, and something we ought to think of perhaps about doing on a more regular basis. This is pretty cool. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Anne Ferguson, who is Professor Emerita of Philosophy, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and has been a lifelong socialist feminist activist around social justice issues, peace, and the environment. Anne?
You'll have to unmute, Anne.
So complicated. This technology is difficult. All right. So anyway, let me start again. Thanks to Shay and all the presenters today for making this discussion of Ami and the impact of her work so insightful and inspiring. The working title of my remarks here is Bridging Divides, Ami's Legacy and What She Meant to Me. So it's a personal reflection of the important aspects of her intellectual and political practice as it impacted on me. And clearly it's not meant to deal with every aspect of her work. I mean, and indeed, all the presentations and discussants here today have given me so many more examples of Ami's legacy that I need to chew on. So my discussion of some points of her thoughts on ethics, politics, and violence is going to be incomplete, since her impact on me, as well as you and others, is still expanding. Ami was my friend. I'm still adjusting to a world without her. She was a special kind of feminist philosopher. She was more like Socrates than Plato, more interested in dialogues and in posing questions that can unite moral and political communities in the search for answers, rather than laying out comprehensive answers to questions. And in an important way, she's a wonderful exemplar of the Socratic dictum to know thyself and to do that in dialogical community with others. She took this dictum very seriously as a teacher of philosophy, as well as women's martial arts, so that the disciplinary practice of building violent bodies for self-defense would not undermine the search for self-knowledge and weaken the aim to build good and moral character. So later I'm going to just talk more about her writing on this subject. Ami was an intense person, someone with a lot of political charisma, but also very thoughtful. She was charming, funny, very authoritative when she wanted to be. And she was also really different from me in a number of ways. We were both lesbians and leftist feminists who believed in an autonomous movement. She was Jewish, I'm a WASP. She was trained in continental philosophy, I in analytic philosophy. She was an immigrant to the US from Israel, while my ancestors have been here for a couple hundred years. She was also someone who trained in martial arts and had been a mentor in a women's dojo training women in self-defense, starting with the Women Against Rape movement in the 1970s in Columbus, Ohio. But on the other hand, my feminist activism had been more based in leftist and feminist anti-war circles, including training in non-violent civil disobedience in the civil rights movement, and feminist ecology, for example, women against nuclear power and nuclear weapons, demands for child care services at my university, working to create a women's studies program. But we were both committed to supporting the autonomous feminist countercultures we inhabited. Both of us saw ourselves as cultural and intellectual workers, analyzing their emerging feminist ethics and politics. Unlike Ami, my feminist activist personal and political practices did not include martial arts or self-defense practices. But Ami's example encouraged me to keep my body in shape and not to fall into the philosophical trap of becoming lost in ideas. So in this way, she was an exemplar to me of a woman thinker who also valued a strong body. Both body and mind can be strong together. I remember fondly a Sophia, that is Socialist and Feminist Philosophers Association, or maybe Philosophers in Action, depending on who you ask. It was a conference weekend when after the conference, some of us women, ending a mountain walk, gathered to learn some basic arm exercises from Ami. It was one of those times when it felt great to inhabit a female body and to explore how to develop some of its potential strengths. The bodily energy that passed between us was similar in some ways to the bodily feeling of solidarity I have had in demonstrations for women's rights and other social justice issues. So now I want to talk about several aspects of Ami's work and legacy as a philosopher. First, Ami is a critic of Western phallocentric philosophy. When we first got to know each other, Ami was already engaged in a monumental service project to introduce feminist voices into the reading of the classic text of Western philosophy. She was in the process of editing a 2-volume set of writings called, respectively, Engendering Origins and Modern Engendering. These anthologies collected work by feminist philosophers doing ideology critique on the foundational text of the Western philosophical canon, as it dealt with or assumed gender differences between men and women. The first volume involves reading of the works of Plato and Aristotle, the second, modern philosophers such as Descartes, Locke, Hume, Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. The feminist thinkers that Ami involved in this project critique aspects of these male foundational creators of Western cultural thought that are sexist, masculinist, or phallocentric. Being the editor of an anthology is a lot of work. I know, I have edited 3 anthologies myself. And so this was a work of love of Ami's for feminist philosophy and for Western philosophy in general. Elaborating the project itself involved a bridging of the historical divide in Western philosophy between continental and analytic philosophical training, and Ami recruited some of the best young feminist philosophers of both traditions to share their research. In so doing, she strengthened us as an intellectual and political group. For those of us developing courses in the philosophy of women or the philosophy of gender, it added a priceless collection of feminist reflections on Western history of philosophy, where there had previously been a dearth of such work. As teachers of the Western philosophical canon, many of us aim to understand our own position as those designated women within a tradition that hegemonically disparaged our ability to be philosophers or thinkers. We wanted to do our job teaching the canon, yet also find a way both to critique and move beyond its patriarchal assumptions, while at the same time acknowledging ways that the canon continued to shape some aspects of our oppositional thinking. Ami was aware of the methodological difficulties of assuming that there is a universal women's or feminist perspective within which we are somehow trapped if we wish as feminists to challenge the gender dualism in ethics, politics, and social life. Indeed, many of the readings in these anthologies are influenced by post-structuralist critiques of essentialism in order to evolve overgeneralization about the hegemonic tendencies within these discourses, as well as to bring out contradictions and valorization of the feminine in some texts which otherwise seem to argue for feminine inferiority. But in spite of the sophistication of the texts she'd gathered together, Ami points out in the introduction that her anthology project is still locked in a problematic bind for feminism, which is that in emphasizing the strength of the gender dualist mandate to oppose the masculine and the feminine, or find them as separate, the writers may be perpetuating a binary text that as feminists they mean to undo. So how do we do this patriarchal ideology critique in a way that does not undermine the resistance feminists have to the ethical and political implications of the gender binary categories that exist in our society today? So as another concern, she notes that the whole project of providing a feminist critique of the European canon of philosophy may itself be Eurocentric and ignoring the way that other non-European philosophies have formed aspects of our philosophical culture and should be taken and should be studied. So I mentioned this early work of Ami's to show that she was already thinking seriously about how to create a non-ideal methodology to do philosophy, and more particularly to think about how to situate ethical and political philosophical questions more contextually. So, and she approached me in the mid-1990s with the idea of doing an anthology of feminist ethics, feminist writings on ethics and politics. And at that point, we'd already got to know each other through our meetings, through the meetings of the APA, the Eastern Society for Women in Philosophy, and our membership in Sophia. So now I want to talk about Ami as a bridge builder among feminist thinkers. I've already talked a little bit about that, but our talks at these meetings were always really delightful, inspiring, and also in more personal settings. Later, as she became the partner of my former graduate student, Lisa Tessman, the three of us would get together and talk philosophy. One common project that brought Ami and me together was how to help bridge ethical and political divides within the women's movement. For example, whether lesbianism was something all feminists ought to aspire to, whether feminists should be pacifists as a way to challenge all political violence, where feminists stood in relation to prostitution, pornography, and sadomasochism in sexuality, whether feminists should support artificial reproductive techniques, whether feminists should be vegetarians and animal rights advocates. So our edited book collection, Daring to Be Good, Essays in Feminist Ethico-Politics, which was published in 1998, was one way we thought to bridge the divide by sharing in one space the diverse answers that feminist intellectuals had come, or some of them, that feminist intellectuals had come up with, as well as their differing approaches to the question of how feminist ethics connects to politics. In our own personal essays in the anthology, we came up with different approaches. In my discussion of the feminist sex debate, I take the analytical philosophical approach of rejecting the binary of morally good versus morally bad, as well as the pro-con structure of arguments that force feminists to take divisive sides. I introduced a third category between good and bad acts, that is, ones I call morally risky, can only be judged ethically in context. I argue that in patriarchal societies, marriage, prostitution, pornography, and sadomasochistic sex are morally risky, and hence whether engaging them is good or bad depends on the context. So feminists should not overgeneralize to assume that all morally risky acts are therefore all either morally permitted or morally forbidden. Ami's essay in our book, which is called Everyday Violence and Ethico-Political Crisis, shows a concern for moral character, perhaps stemming from her background in continental philosophy, where studying virtue is one of the main approaches to ethics. She reflects on how the gendered virtues expected of women as opposed to men can create situations of moral fragility for both men and women put in situations of everyday violence. And these are the sort that Yasemin Sari mentioned earlier today. Ami calls this ethico-political impoverishment. Ami claims in this essay that women in particular situations of violence can show moral defects due to their social training as women. Such defects are ignored by those feminist analyses which only theorize the advantageous insights that the social position of being a woman can bring to ethical and political problems. Her article uses examples of situations of war or deep structural oppression that pit one racial or ethnic group against another. Her examples of morally defective action on the part of women engaged in ethnic conflict include a Palestinian kindergarten teacher teaching young boys, but not girls, to train themselves to be future fighters for Palestinian rights by playing war games where Jews are the bad guys and they are the good warriors. And another example is an Israeli Jewish woman who seeks extra-legal vengeance on the family of a Palestinian terrorist who killed her husband. In both cases, the women dehumanize their political opponents and seek retributive justice in a gendered way that demand the relevant women enact an eye for an eye. She uses these cases of ethical defects caused by war to critique those who would romanticize the effects of terror caused in revolutionary struggles. And, in the process, she critiques not only Hegel, but also Sartre and Fanon, who emphasize the remoralizing strategy that violent anti-colonial revolutions can have on the oppressed. But, similarly, she critiques those feminist researchers who use the revalue the feminine strategy in citing cases in which women on both sides of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict become transformed through their gendered suffering through the war to develop a critical awareness and resistance to what they conceive of, and this is a quote, man-made war and social order. Her childhood experiences with violence, and they've been mentioned a little today, are reminders of the danger of overgeneralizing women's bodily experience. As she relates, hers were different than most girls. At a young age, when she was being bullied, her single mother admonished her to learn to defend herself, since there was no father there to protect her. And so she learned to use violence on the streets in self-defense. To reinforce this practice of gender deviance, she also engaged in child and adulthood war games that were part of militarist Israeli settler culture. Such exercises aimed to produce violent bodies, mostly male, but with some female exceptions like herself, to protect the state from Palestinian opposition. Although she does not draw this conclusion directly, Ami's actions could be described as genderqueer, since she was a female with physical martial skills in a body designed discipline for violence in a masculine way, and also a lesbian not fitting into heterosexist norms of proper womanhood. So let me now talk about Ami and the concept of the ethico-political, which I think is an original Ami concept. I mean, as far as I know, I haven't heard others talk about it before her. She convinced me to use it in describing the essays in our book. It's a metaphor which suggests that the ethical, seen as the sphere of individual decisions about what constitutes as good and bad actions, or good and bad life, should not be seen as completely separate from the political, the public sphere where groups act and bring about change. Because political actions of groups can themselves be just or unjust, good or bad, and can in turn influence the moral character and ethical decisions of individuals. On the other hand, as Alice Macklin has pointed out earlier today, Ami does believe the political sphere has its own independent collective normativity. So Ami follows, but also uses the methodological example of Plato in a non-ideal way. So where Plato in the Republic analyzes the virtues of the ethical individual by first mirroring them in his vision of the ideal society, Ami uses a picture of a non-ideal society to raise questions about a non-ideal ethical life. Her methodological strategy has her moving from a critique of the political implications of militarism in the Spartist Zionist state that Israel has become, in other words, the politics of her people and nation of origin, to an ethical questioning of her personal ethic of creating a militarized body, a body with ongoing prime capacity for violence, as a feminist martial arts trainer and one earlier trained in Israel to have a violent body. In her exercise in her book on Inherent, the subject of violence, she critiques the non-ideal aspect of contemporary Jewish society, which, as she says, and this is a quote, because of its statist, nationalist, separatist Zionism has come to be organized around its capacity for violence, unquote. She goes on to say that contemporary Israel, as Arendt feared, may become, another quote, a Sparta-like small warrior tribe, secluded inside what it perceives as ever-threatened borders, absorbed with physical self-defense to a degree that submerges all other interests, its economic development determined exclusively by the needs of war. If this is a non-ideal nation state, then how is it mirrored in the non-ideal social group and individual? Ami focuses on the effects of group militarized discipline on the individuals participating in this discipline, and she segues to feminist martial arts training. So a key question she asked herself is how to reconcile her lifelong training in martial arts with a feminist politics that wants to eliminate everyday violence, not only of men against women, but of the violence that more powerful states and human groups use against states and groups they seek to dominate or eliminate. Women training as a social and political group to create violent bodies as a strategy of self-defense against everyday male violence against women is an example of a non-morally ideal but politically justified project. She defends it as a feminist, ethical, and political strategy, and as other people have mentioned earlier today, she disagrees with Arendt, who did not define actions taken in self-defense as political. But using her non-ideal approach to such questions, Ami argues that what is political depends on the context. So in training their bodies to be violent weapons for self-defense, martial arts women are also acting as a transgressive political group in a rent sense, since they are challenging the power relations of the patriarchal status quo, where femininity can only seek self-defense through appeal to the masculine protective power of the male body. So now let me turn to the morally risky nature of feminist martial arts. So, and what I'm doing here is I'm framing Ami's ethical concerns using my own moral vocabulary. I think Ami's ethical worry here is that martial arts train one to be able to use one's body violently, and such violent body production, even when feminist, is morally risky, because it employs a political tactic that can become problematic and can produce moral failures in individuals similar to those of militarized cultures. So I would suggest that Sarah Clark Miller's point earlier today that Ami emphasized the moral ambivalence in such training is a way to suggest its morally risky nature. So as Ami says, and this is a quote from her, and I'm quoting the whole thing, some people have quoted part of it today, feminists who take on bringing into being violent women's bodies have to stay aware of this. A feminist cannot merely celebrate the transgressive excess that she creates through the construction of her own or other violent women's bodies. She must concern herself with quite complex questions about the possibility that as women's bodies become habituated to violent action, they may act in ways that inhumanely and destructively transgress the boundaries that are specified by an ethico-political justification for the action they are undertaking. This is a possibility that cannot be dismissed as too marginal to worry about, not in light of the extensive evidence regarding the enormity of past and present abusive or cruel violence in which women, too, have undertaken, unquote. So while she presents the situation of women martial arts training as a morally risky one, she does conclude that it's justified morally and politically as long as women who engage in it remain reflective of the moral risks involved. And Diana Taylor today gave us one lesson that some feminist anti-gender violence activists have taken from Ami, which is that collective counter-violence by feminist activists against male perpetrators might be seen as a political act even when it uses violence, and justified. But as we saw today with Mecca Nagel's paper, there's also an ongoing agonistic feminist political controversy about whether such collective violence may defeat the political goals sought, if that is some form of transformational justice process that would mitigate sexual violence in the future. So let me just kind of conclude my remarks here by summarizing what I think are 3 ethico-political lessons that Ami's writing suggests for feminist communities with respect to moral to political violence. And here I just want to say these aren't the only 3 lessons, because we've had excellent papers today by other panelists on questions of terror, speechless horror, defensive inattention, fear as a justified political emotion, and on fascism. And I'm sure that Louis Gordon and Laurie Gruen will also yield other insights. So these are just merely some that I've gleaned in my particular discussions and interactions with Ami. And the first lesson is to avoid the trap of seeing women only as victims of wars which are enacted by men, because women too can perpetuate the dehumanization that such violence brings. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is not to romanticize either revolutionary violence or the role of women in war, whether they're acting as gender deviants and fighting in wars as soldiers, or as survivors of war, or as peace activists opposing war. And the third concerns the need for a coalitional ethics in politics, which I'll talk about shortly. With respect to the second trap, romanticization, Ami exposes a non-ideal feminist politics that does not overgeneralize women's position, to quote her words, quote, as promising a revolutionary ethico-political perspective. Many of us in the socialist feminist left, including myself, have tended to make this mistake. in order to combat the tendency of the reductionist Marxist left to argue that only the proletariat offers the hope of what Ami calls a revolutionary ethical political perspective, some of us argued that women constitute another kind of revolutionary social group. I called it a sex class in my earlier work. But Ami argues that, quote, taken as a group, women are an ambiguous lot when it comes to ethico-politics, unquote. In a move that's prescient when it was written in 1996 when we were creating this book, Ami sides with Stanley Aronowitz in pointing out that capitalism has not developed as Marx expected, and has frustrated Marx's expectations for the proletariat as a progressive united force. So the racial, ethnic, and national divisions exacerbated by the successes of neoliberalism and the increasing precarity of workers means that those fighting for social justice, whether we're feminist or anti-capitalist or anti-racist or anti-ethnicist, seem to need to develop a social justice coalition politics based not only on identities, but also solidarities across social differences to fight against all forms of social injustice. The third trap is a kind of righteous identity politics, sometimes found among feminists who refuse coalitions with those with whom they disagree. So as with violence, feminists have also disagreed about how to handle other disagreements. Should the institution of prostitution be seen as perpetuating violence against women? Should it be legalized? With respect to war, should we be pacifists? But are there no justified cases of humanitarian intervention to avoid genocide? Should we be carceral feminists demanding that men guilty of rape and domestic violence be subject to the death penalty or jailed? Or as Diana Taylor suggests, should militant feminist violent bodies attack such feminist perpetrators by using counter-violence? Or as Mecca suggests, in disagreement, should we be looking for a reconciliation and restorative justice practice? So we need a conversation space, as Diana mentioned, between anti-carceral feminist defenders against male violence and anti-carceral abolitionist feminists against racist mass incarceration, as a way to move beyond the gender and racial institutions that legitimate violence. So in conclusion, my final remarks. We've lost Ami too soon, but her mentorship and ideas remain for us to develop, learn from, and live by. We will continue to be involved in liberation struggles for social injustice, whether they be feminist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, or pro-ecological and animal justice. And so, in the spirit of the tradition of those who celebrate fallen heroes in Latin American liberation struggles, I would like to say to the spirit of Ami Baran, who is with us today, Bat Ami Baran Presente.
Ami Baran Presente. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, Anne. That was really lovely. Our second speaker then is Lewis Gordon, who is professor of philosophy and the department head at the University of Connecticut.
Thank you, Melissa. To everyone, I begin with Wanasikuk, that's Wampanoag. Here in New England, as we know, the Wampanoag people welcomed the pilgrims in, and that kindness wasn't returned. I also would like to say both Shalom and Shavua Tov for those of us who are Jewish in the audience, beginning our week. And to everybody, good evening. And thank you to the organizers for putting this together for our beloved. It's not just dear, but beloved, Batami Baron. My condolences to Ami's family, to Lisa, to all of us. And her family, as you know, is not only her immediate family, but the many communities across the globe for whom she fought so dearly. We're approaching the Yahrzeit, the year of Ami's becoming an ancestor, and I will be among those lighting a candle for her. Now, one of the things about people's names we talk about, many of us are referring to Ami, but, it always struck me that it's so unusual that, particularly in the United States, a lot of English speakers don't know the meanings of their names. But if one were in another society, for instance, one such as Israel, where one would speak Hebrew, most people are aware of what their names mean. But what's also striking, and perhaps this is a psychoanalytical point, it has always struck me that people who often don't know the meaning of their names often in a strange way embody those meanings. So it's this rare case where someone could embody the meaning and know it as well. Now, Batami is translated as daughter of our nation, but Ami also means being trustworthy, being reliable. In a word, truth. It's funny in philosophy, we use the word truth a lot, but in the more formalistic ways of talking about truth, what's often elided, what's often not addressed, is the extent to which truth is a form of trustworthiness. It's the extent to which you can invest in that truth. This means then a human being could embody truth. And one of the things many of us know about Ami is that she was no BS, and her lack of deception enabled a profound level of trust. Now, her last name, Baron, it's translated often as son of or vigor, potency. But if you put it together, you get this very, very unusual combination of what it is to be the daughter of a nation and the embodiment of strength. Now, I met Ami through Sophia. Shout out to Sophia all day. Sophia is one of those beautiful examples of what it is to gather in the spirit of commitment to the flourishing and growth of each other. I met Ami when I just got my PhD, the very beginning of my career. But as many of you know, you never really meet Ami, because to encounter her is as if to have always known her. She is, and I've heard references to Plato throughout this day's event, she is a form of remembering. So to meet Ami was an act of a profound level of reconnecting. And Ami and I, over the years, we've talked about philosophical ideas, but the correspondence we were having before I got very ill and then distraught at the news of her passing was about Jewish themes. And quite often when we go through contemporary philosophy, there's an extent to which there are Jewish themes that, because of the Christocentrism secularized in much Euromodern philosophy, those themes are often repressed. Now, a Jewish theme that Ami and I have talked about, and she wanted me to write something for her, but as I said, I got ill, is around the concept of openness. Now, I know there are the Orthodox, there are people who are stuck in letter-lawed views of dealing with reality, but a fundamental issue in Judaism is that you don't name God and you don't have the hubris or the temerity to assert yourself as a God. This openness, this non-naming, enables a situation in which you now face the question of the responsibility for that which is not named. And it leads to something rather profound, which is the ethical responsibility for responsibility itself. It is what informs the concept that's often mistranslated. You know, a lot of people refer to Jewish people as chosen people, but it's not chosen in the sense of being better than other people. It's more properly translated as being called to take responsibility. And this being called to take responsibility means that it can crush you. This is one of the reasons why in much of Jewish mythology, but also in sacred texts, the called often runs away, because you will be taking on so much. And I'm sure that Lisa and Ami thought about this at their daughter's bat mitzvah, the very symbol of taking on the responsibility for the ethical weight of reality. And this you do when you carry Torah. But at the heart of this is what we can call anti-idolatry. And this important move against idolatry is crucial, because at the heart of idolatry is an effort to squeeze humanity into something that could never actually contain the ethical voice. And that squeezing in becomes the suffering, the sorrow, the pain, but also the violence. Ami's book, The Subject of Violence, addresses similar themes, although she talks about it, as Anne brought out, in ethico-political terms, and she looks through Hannah Arendt, and she examines terrorism, etc. But she looks at this to address concerns of subjection and the technologies of violence and the marginalization of political life through which genocide finds fertile ground. Now, her argument about the destruction of human relations is crucially on point. We often forget this when we talk about violence, which is one of the reasons why too many people confuse violence simply with force. You cannot have, there could be circumstances without physical force, but the presence of violence. If we think about everyday violence, we think about colonialism, we think about degradation, these practices are violent. But what we know also is that human beings require human reality through which to live. And that one, human reality that is the production of power understood as increasing the options for meaningful life. And this is crucial because you see, there are certain forms of thought that look at power in very reductionistic ways. They reduce it to the coercive mechanisms that's locked into the more Hobbesian view of how human beings as separated things collide with each other. However, if we understand power as the ability to make things happen, we can use that ability to cultivate in others their abilities to make things happen as well. In short, we can create a situation of the cultivation and the flourishing of agency. And within that framework, this becomes in a direct collision with the use of power for disempowerment. So if we come to the ethico-political idea that, as Ami formulated it, it pertains fundamentally to relational forms of thinking. Because you see, if you think about that other model, it's solipsistic, it's self-evolved, it's me, 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 me. And ultimately, it's a confusion of the self with world. It collapses into the form of idolatry of which I just spoke. But if we reject that idolatry, it means we now have to be open, which means we're in relationships with others. And if that relationship is there, the communicability of that relationship becomes a form of empowering, which makes fundamentally oppression, degradation, dehumanization, whether it's from racism to sexism, to be forms of disempowerment, which means then the political task at hand is increasing the options through which people can live meaningful lives. Now, I'd like to make a note on the violent body, as it's been brought up a lot today. I would argue that a body premised upon self-defense isn't a violent body. Instead, that is a body that's paradoxically an anti-violence body, because violence proper requires violation. And this is where the ethical and the political meet. Because you see, the unethical use of force is fundamentally violent, but it is not fundamentally violent to try to stop violence, even with the use of force. Understood in this way, violence pertains to force that should not be made manifest. If it's a force that should be made manifest, including through acts of care, paradoxically, then it is fundamentally not violence. Now, this, I've heard Fanon's name brought up here and there, and Hannah Arendt, unfortunately, really represented Fanon, but, you know, as James Baldwin and Jane Gordon and others have pointed out, Hannah Arendt and Catherine Bell, Hannah Arendt had a race problem, particularly with Blacks. But we should bear in mind something, which is that Frantz Fanon actually detested violence. And you could see it not only in Alice Shirky writings, but also in a lot of his letters. What he was actually arguing for was something very similar to Ami's position, which is the importance of standing up for oneself and respect. If one is living in a society in which one's humanity is illicit, in other words, there's antipathy to seeing a meeting of the idea of the human being in one's body, then one's very embodiment becomes structured in an unjust, a misanthropic society as a violation of appearance. And under those circumstances, what is one to do? If one were to concede non-appearance, one becomes complicit with the everyday, ongoing violence that takes the form of one's dehumanization. So I see part of Ami's work, not only in martial arts, but even in those very unusual ways in which she lived her body as an ongoing praxis against the invisibility of not only her as a lesbian, not only her as a woman, not only her as a person, and it's a complex one in Judaism, if we think about, for instance, from Ashkenazi to Mizrahi, etc. But also the idea that it is not neat separations by which people live, but actually ongoing communicative practices that transcend us. And these practices, this commitment, requires a lot of courage, and it takes the form of love. Now, I know Hannah Arendt had a lot of problems with talking about politics and love, but we should bear in mind that, and we already know about Arendt's dissertation, for instance, on St. Augustine, where she began to look at it, particularly in the Christian context. But the thing about love is that a lot of Euromodernity has used similitude as the premise of love. It's a form of narcissistic love through which there is a presupposition that one could only love those who are similar to oneself. And this informs a particular conception of moral and ethical life that leads to the ongoing analogical reproduction of the same. I think Anne was right when she brought up that queering element, precisely because the existential dimension of what it is to be a human being is to stand out from being absorbed into similitude. This means the standing out raises the possibility always to transcend the re-inscribed self-referential model of love. A consequence of this is something we all know, and that is that human beings have the capacity to love that which those who are not identical with the self. And this difference element in love is very important precisely because if we understand that coercive power tries to draw power in and treats it as a zero-sum game, which means extracting power from others, the thing about radical love is it's a form of letting go through which there can be the growth of empowerment in a point in which it eventually loses any notion of ultimately being a reproduction of the self. The reason this is important is because ultimately all political acts lead to the anonymous. All political action ultimately, when reached, when extended enough, becomes a function of a social world, not only in terms of one's contemporaries, but also in terms of fidelity to those who preceded us, many of whom we don't know, and to those who will succeed us, most of whom we will never know. This act of radical love raises the complicated question of what it means then to be the condition of possibility for what is ultimately irreplaceable. Now, Ami is among our irreplaceables. There's a way she was in Lisa's life that is so unique through her children's life and through her students that we've realized that we're dealing right now with a converging understanding that her sui generity is such that ultimately it is not to replace her, but it is to build upon what she offered. So I conclude with an elegy. Some of you may not know that I write these, but I also write poetry. So an elegy for Ami. Daughter of the nation, a meeting of land and sea. So she was with strength of a transformed surname. Solid and fluid, fluid and solid, her strong arms opened wide. Her heart open, her curly hair danced with the wind. That paradoxical, visible invisibility known through voice. Listen, we are asked, listen. Feast for times to come, feast. Love for times to come, love. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. That was lovely. Absolutely lovely. So we have one more scheduled speaker. That's Lori Gruen. She is William Griffin Professor of Philosophy and Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies and Science in Society at Wesleyan University. Lori.
Thank you. Some people confuse me with William these days, but I'm Lori still. I want to also thank Saba and Shay and all of the speakers and moderators today, including Anne and Louis. What a rich set of papers and a terrific tribute to Ami's work. I want to spend my time, and I'll be brief, talking about Ami's inspiration and Ami herself. I'm honored and really saddened actually to speak tonight. I had this magical thought that Ami was going to just be with us forever. And I'm really heartbroken to have been wrong about that. Like many of us, I deeply feel the loss of the vibrant, powerful, no bullshit, badass presence that was Ami. And I have to confess too, that when I turn to thoughts of Ami, I can't help but be overcome by sorrow for Lisa and Yuval's loss. But I also really deeply admire their strength. I was recently in a conversation with a friend who lost a loved one, and she said that one of the things that inspired her to carry on was the idea of trying to take up or embody some quality of her beloved that she particularly admired. And I've been thinking about all the things I admired about Ami in preparation for some of my memorial remarks tonight. And one of the things that kept coming to mind, and it's been mentioned in different ways throughout the day, is that Ami was acutely attuned to others, so much so that, as we learned, she even can perceive very early pregnancies, something I didn't know. And I was wondering this afternoon whether she knew someone was pregnant before they did, and thought, well, that would be pretty helpful in Texas right now. Anyway, like Lewis, I met Ami through Sophia. I knew Ami for nearly 30 years, though I didn't see her often. When we did end up in the same place, it felt like not much time had gone by. What I always felt after we parted company is that I really felt seen by her, genuinely seen. And that got me thinking about recognition and misrecognition and the role it plays in many of the horrors that Ami wrote about over her career and in some of the papers we heard today, and the ongoing struggle for recognition, both in our political work moving towards justice and in our everyday experiences within the profession of philosophy, where I suspect most of us, at least some of the time, feel profoundly unseen. Let me briefly say a bit about the political importance of recognition and the harms of misrecognition, and then I'll turn to some very brief comments about the thrilling experience of being genuinely seen by Ami. In recent work on epistemic injustice, particularly testimonial injustice, the topic of misrecognition has been discussed a lot. As Jose Medina argues in his recent paper on the topic, there are two types of misrecognition. One is what he calls quantitative recognition deficit, and that comes in two varieties. One in which a topic is just not taken up, and he uses the example of racial violence, but I think gender violence and the violent body are other examples that can be seen here as well. The other is when a person attempting to articulate concerns about a topic aren't listened to or heard or seen. These quantitative pathologies, as Medina puts it, are usually the subject of analysis of epistemic injustice, and often the solution involves calls for more inclusive or deeper discussions to make what isn't recognized more socially visible. But consider non-binary or trans people, for example, and the systematic misrecognition that they experience. These go beyond quantitative recognition deficits, at least now. As Robin Dembroff writes, quote, non-binary identities often are not only ignored, but unintelligible. Once again, this system of misrecognition is generated by structures and practices that construct and define dominant gender roles. Within most dominant contexts, non-binary gender simply do not appear. Though non-binary identities are increasingly recognized within queer communities, they're often not seen in dominant contexts. Much as a generation ago, same-sex relationships were misrecognized in this way. And this sort of misrecognition or erasure extends beyond testimonial silencing and often directly contributes to violence. Police violence, mass incarceration, intimate partner violence, and suicide, the kinds of violence that I think we need to be thinking much more about. certainly Ami had been thinking a lot about violence for a very long time. As Medina writes, quote, when a phenomenon like racial violence becomes systematically distorted, it's naive to expect that the distortions will automatically disappear when more attention is given to the topic or when more credibility is given to the victims or groups affected. In other words, there's a deeper dysfunction, a more complex form of misrecognition that's operating, and increased social visibility is not necessarily going to remedy these injustices. This is a way of thinking about how to move beyond this kind of dualism. You can't really imagine that, well, we can get rid of misrecognition, at least of this sort, by sort of forcing recognition. That's not really what's going to work. And I think that's in the spirit of some of Ami's thinking. This deeper dysfunction can be located not in epistemic injustice and the violence that can spring from it, but rather in a perhaps more fundamental failure of recognition that distorts or eliminates the subject, such that their moral injuries can't be seen, can't get uptake. In failing to have a means for uptake of these moral injuries, one's sense of self and capacity to form meaningful relationships, both personal and political, can be undermined. Forms of invisibility, humiliation, and erasure can preclude the possibility of meaningful political agency. And as many thinkers have noted in different registers, including Robin Dillon, who I think is here, the lack of self-respect that springs from misrecognition can distort a person's ability to act. And I would suggest their ability to even be motivated to act. As Diana Taylor noted earlier this morning, citing Judith Butler's work in Frames of War, some forms of this type of misrecognition obliterate the subjects such that they can't be mourned because they must remain nameless. It's akin to what theorist Calvin Warren describes as ontological violence. He writes, quote, the state of injury, and he's talking about the state of injury produced by anti-Blackness. So the state of injury runs much deeper than physical abuse, torture, and violation. It's an ontological violence. This form of violence situates Blacks outside the traditional terms of humanism and into the realm we might describe as the ontological state of exception. This is still him. Neither biopolitics nor necropolitics cover this Black being in the exception because both discourses presume a human being upon which politics exercises power. Indeed, we might suggest that Blacks are placed in the netherworld of conceptual chaos that marks the limits of politics. And I think this just picks up on a tone that Lewis was just mentioning. This is from an article of Calvin Warren's called Black Interiority, Freedom, and the Impossibility of Living. Or consider this comment from one of the incarcerated students that I've worked with, James Davis III. He writes, the imposition of the prisoner identity is effectuated through different means. He's physically separated from the world and everything that entails. He's forced into a new cold world of brick, concrete, and steel, surrounded by the quiet violence of razor wire fencing, the very existence of which highlights his dangerousness and proclaims that he deserves his captivity. His identity is socially stigmatized, but as a Black man, he's conscious of the stigma of being a prisoner before ever becoming one. Once in prison, the prisoner must contend with the conceptions that are intended to define him as other than who he is. These forms of violent misrecognition devastate. But there may be contexts in which to combat this sort of misrecognition. I tend to lean towards pessimism, so I'm not maybe the best person to think about what might counter this misrecognition. Perhaps we can see it in protest slogans like, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," or "Hands up, don't shoot." These are statements that target conditions of recognition themselves. Maybe feast can be seen as a space within our profession for this deeper sort of recognition, the recognition that we're providing for Ami and her work and her memory. Some classrooms might be such places. I'm sure that Ami's classrooms were such places. I think my prison classrooms, or I hope my prison classrooms, are sometimes those sites that can combat dysfunctional misrecognition. I've gone into thinking about this notion of misrecognition in part because it seems precisely the opposite of what it is that Ami Baran represented. And so I wanted to think about how we can take amazing quality of hers and bring it into the future. I went into a little bit of a rabbit hole thinking about the recognition literature, and I don't want to go any deeper into that hole. So let me come back to Ami's profound capacity to genuinely see and recognize us, her friends, her new acquaintances, students, newly pregnant people. And as Lewis said, so I think observantly, it was about, in some ways, being with Ami was like being with her again, even if it was new. It was a remembering. Her marvelous perceptual attunement is certainly a virtue, but I think this capacity, this ability to make those she's talking to really feel seen and heard, to cut through the noise and get to the core of what we want to argue or what we are saying, is an ethical, political achievement. It's an accomplishment. She did this without, it seemed to me, putting my views through her views, without needing to translate my words and thoughts through the theories that she found most compelling. And we had very different starting points and ending points. There was a real sense in which I felt both who I am and what I value was held up, elevated, supported in her presence. It was more than kindness, more than compassion. It provided me, at least, with a feeling of fullness and deep satisfaction. She didn't agree often with what I was saying, and that isn't what recognition requires, but I felt understood. It's a capacity that I treasure and will endeavor to both theorize about and attempt to enact further in an effort to do what my other friends suggested, to try to embody that which I so admired in Ami, so that she can stay with me, particularly when I feel unseen or occluded. And I encourage you all to take up that quality of Ami's to help others to be seen and held and valued. Thanks.
So wonderful. If we could give a nice round of applause to all of our speakers in this session, this has just been great. We do now have lots of time to open the floor to people in the audience who are interested in offering some reminiscence or thoughts about Ami and her work, maybe its effect on themselves. I know a couple of people have already signed up for that, so I'm going to start with those people. But if more would like to take this opportunity to offer your thoughts and share some memories, please use the raise hand feature so that we will be able to put you into a queue, and we'll be able to then go through, hopefully, whoever would like to speak. So, so first I'm going to call on Allison Jagger to offer her thoughts.
Thank you so much for letting me go, Melissa, because I sadly have to leave at 8:15 Central Time. It's just after 6 here in Pacific. You actually took me by surprise. Let me just find the little thing I want. I just have a small, but very vivid and kind of, to me, fun memory of Ami that I want to share. I'd like to start by thanking, of course, the conference organizers and the speakers for their moving memories and reflections on Ami's life and work. I knew her since she was Dave Schweikert's grad student at Ohio State. I was at the University of Cincinnati. And I was among the many women that Ami developed, encouraged to develop our bodily strength. And one thing she did was send me several sheets of martial arts exercises to practice. And I did for a while, unfortunately fallen off now. But one of my favorite memories of Ami goes back to a central APA meeting in Columbus, Ohio, which was probably around 1980. And Midwestern SWIP wanted to put on a panel on lesbian separatism. And I think, so far as I remember, the speakers were Claudia Card, Marilyn Fry, and Jeffna Allen. And I was the chair of the session. Anyway, one of the things that distinguished the session was we decided to exclude men, even though it was on the APA program. And Ami was posted on the door. And there wasn't any real scuffling, but she was a formidable presence, and no men got in. And it caused a storm in the APA because it was seen as discriminatory to exclude men. And I remember that Joan Straumanis, who was a SWIP member then at Denison, stayed up half the night trying to pacify the executive director of the APA. I forgot his name, John something, we could look it up, and promised that SWIP would never do such a thing again. But it was such a worthwhile occasion, partly because it brought SWIP together, and the separatists in Midwestern SWIP felt supported by other SWIPpies. And it could never have happened without Ami's formidable presence on the door. Ami was such a beautiful person, I thought, physically, philosophically, and spiritually. I'm grateful to have known her, and she'll always remain treasured in my heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. That was lovely. Courtney, I think you are next.
Okay. Thank you for allowing us to speak outside of the 3 scheduled pieces. Can I ask, are we timing right at 3 minutes?
No, you're okay.
Okay, thank you. I know it went around in an email earlier, and I did not prepare remarks in advance. I won't overspeak, but I did want to be aware of the timing. So I am one of Ami's graduate students. I have been exceptionally lucky in that I've been able to work with Ami for quite a long time. Perhaps not great for my dissertation trajectory, but I came in right out of undergrad, very young. And one of the pieces that was circling in the department was a piece that Ami had written about how to respond to undergraduate students who want to go to grad school for philosophy. And in the piece, she says that we should tell them no, we should give them reasons not to go. And it's, of course, to get students thinking. At the time, it was primarily to get them to understand the costs of going to grad school, the difficulty of the job market, and so on. And for me, I really took issue with the piece. I really struggled with the message. Luckily, I was already there at grad school, so it's not like she was going to kick me out or anything. But I took this piece to Ami, and I wanted to talk to her about it. And it was one of the first times that we had seriously disagreed on anything. And so this was new territory for me, as being very young and not entirely sure of how to approach Ami about something that I didn't see eye to eye on her with. And I was concerned at the time that this would send the wrong message to students who already felt they didn't belong in grad school, students who, not necessarily an imposter syndrome, but maybe just did not have the background or the social network of folks who understood what graduate work was like. And so really folks like myself, I was the first in my family to go to college. And so the last thing I needed was this article from my own advisor saying, we really should tell you not to come, it's not worth your time. But there were a couple of things that I took away from that conversation that influenced really the rest of my time, all of my time with Ami. One was that I had to think very seriously about what I was doing in grad school. You know, it wasn't about a career or teaching. She really was aware of the difficulties, of course, of the job market, and she made that abundantly clear to me in a way that I couldn't possibly have understood prior to our discussion. But she really wanted me to think about the other ways in which grad school would be costly to me as a student, as a person, not least of which was the time that I would put into sort of working on this project and sticking out this goal of mine. And so I had to think about why I was there. And I came up with so many projects, too many projects maybe, things that I wanted to learn, things that I could tell, you know, Ami, when you first meet her, or, you know, when you first sort of remember her, right? It's not really a meeting, as I think Lewis mentioned. But when I first met her, I knew there were so many things that she knew that I couldn't even begin to fathom, couldn't even begin to imagine, things that I had hoped to learn from her. And so I started making a list, and she obliged, I think, all of the projects that I requested, some of which fit on my CV and some of which offered an education so far beyond the degree that I'm grateful and appalled at the same time that I didn't fully comprehend exactly what I was asking of her when I asked her to teach me some of the things that I requested. But part of what struck me about the way that Ami approached that conversation, the way that Ami approached all of our time together, really the way that Ami approached advising and students and teaching and just all of the hats that she saw herself as wearing, was that she was very patient, very kind. I came into the program with a very sort of Southern or Midwestern idea of power and how it worked, of what authority looked like. And I gave Ami, unintentionally, of course, every opportunity to yell or to admonish, to tell me that I was doing things incorrectly. And she never took the opportunity. It was never important to her. It was not her understanding of how power worked. And she was at all times very much aware of her role and the power that she held as an advisor and as someone who was really shaping not only my graduate career, but my life. And so that was one of the things that became a central project for me, sort of without my intention to it, was to watch how Ami could wield all of the power that she had, all of the authority. You know, to know her was to hope that she found something valuable in what you had to say or what you thought. And she rose to the occasion every single time. And so I just wanted to think, I guess, a little bit about the way in which she was willing to guide, the way in which she was willing to hold others up, you know, if we're thinking of Lori's presentation just now, and the great personal lengths in terms of her time, in terms of the mental energy that I asked of her to expend with some of the topics that I chose. Just her willingness to do that was phenomenal. It was really one of the best gifts I think I'll ever receive. So.
Thank you, Courtney. It's great. Do we have other people who would like to offer some thoughts or memories? I don't see.
I had put my name in the queue as well.
Great. Go ahead, Saba.
Hey, so my name is Saba Fatma, and I was a grad student in Binghamton. I met Ami. I don't know why I'm already emotional. I met Ami in 2003, and I took a class with her where I wrote a paper on, this is not sad, I don't know. I wrote a paper with her on political solidarity, and she gave me a B on the draft. And on the draft, on top of it, she just wrote like one comment, like Lisa puts a ton of red marks all over your paper, and it can really throw you off when you get Lisa's comments. But Ami just had like one comment up on the top, and it said, "What's at stake?" And then somewhere underneath it, it said, "Come see me." So I went and, talked to her, and she told me that, my paper read like a literature review, and that she wasn't interested in that. And that she said, that after finishing up my paper, she really wasn't sure what was at stake. Like, why was she reading this paper? What was so significant? Why was my take significant? Or, essentially what's at stake here? And I ended up carrying that message with me forever. And I actually have what's at stake in my slides for my intro class for reasoning and argumentation. I actually put that phrase when I'm teaching them how to write philosophical arguments. I put that up just because I think that's such a pertinent question to ask when you write something. Like, why are you writing that? What's at stake for you? What's at stake for the reader, She was also very blunt, but it was always buried in kindness and warmth. And she was also funny and very sharp. Like, she would answer you like right away, And so one time I came out of my class. I was an instructor at the time, and I came out of my class, and she was standing there. And I didn't realize she had been observing me for like 5 minutes or so. And she said, "Dress better." And I said, "What about you?" Because we had, by that time, we had that kind of relationship. This is obviously later. By the time I became instructor, I'd been a grad student for some time. And she was super quick, though. She said, "When you become prolific and famous, dress however you'd like." I'm like, okay, point taken. And so, yes, now I've started to look older, but for the longest time, the first half of the semester, I would like dress better. I would dress good, just to establish some authority. Like, her point was like, you look like one of the undergrads, establish some authority in class. And so I carry that as well. And then I remember I told her that I was getting married to someone who I had just met. And she didn't obviously understand that. She was like, okay. She said that the journey would be very, very difficult ahead. And she was very, very right. She was super duper right. She was on point as always. She was very happy that my husband was younger than I. And she said that, as a feminist, as a strong woman, it's probably better off for you to marry a younger guy, especially in the patriarchal setting that we live in. I was like, that is true, and so that part actually played out well in my marriage. I did strongly disagree with her politically on so many things, but as Courtney said, she was always very kind to overlook that. And she maintained her kindness despite the many things that we disagreed on. And so obviously last year, I know, was probably a very difficult year for many. So same on this side. It was a terrible year for me. There was like there was like burnout, childcare. My parents were living with me. I was always scared that they were going to get COVID. My husband was working in a COVID ward. And then right before Ami's death, I also lost someone. I lost someone who was also very dear to me. And so by the time that I received Ami's news, it was just way too much, like to you know, and it really, you know, I was already not in the right state of mind by that point, but it really launched me into despair. And eventually I was very, very angry. I was like very angry because, you know, you don't imagine that somebody who's, you know, that young and, you know, you imagine them to have like a vibrant career ahead and like, you know, writing even more stuff and meeting them. Like, I was just thinking, okay, well, you know, I'm going to see Lisa and Ami again soon at another feast conference. And, but that's not what was, you know, that's, I guess, I don't know, God works in whatever ways God works in. So that was, you know, kind of sad. And yeah, I'm gonna miss her. I miss her terribly. And I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Saba. I'm sure that there are many of us who feel very similar. And I'm a sympathy crier, so as soon as somebody else starts to cry, I start to cry. So thank you for that, because I've been waiting, and now I can just go ahead and shed a few tears. So are there other people who'd like to speak?
I was going to say something.
Great.
I was actually going to give a bit of a different vibe. Interesting to see if anybody else had ever had this sort of relationship to Ami. So Ami was my advisor, and I'm trying to figure out how best to frame this point. She and I both have a very strong past of trauma. And the way that we've both been shaped from our trauma has made us very similar, but very different. Half of you will believe this and half of you will not. I'm an emotional disaster as a result of my trauma. I'm very volatile and very fragile, right? I'm really reactive and like super sensitive. And so everyone's talking about how Ami can recognize you or really see you. Well, that's true. But it was very hard for me to deal with, right? Because as at least everyone who knows me knows, like I project at least a certain kind of manner. Right. And for somebody to be able to see me so clearly as so vulnerable and so fragile and so out of control all the time, it was very overwhelming. And my connection to Ami I don't want to say it was strained, but it was heavy. I knew that anytime that I would walk into her space, I could feel the weight of her recognition, right, for me and what I was like and what I was always going through inside my head and how it would always manifest. And, you know, it was weird. And while my trauma made me really unstable, I would say that at least in part, her trauma made her very stable. Right. So one of the reasons why I've done as well as I have is because Ami was able to get me places in a certain sense, but not by sheer force. It was always like she could just like kind of stand coolly behind me, but I felt like fire underneath my feet where I was like, I'm going. Right. And so there was a sort of security in being with Ami, even though it felt very, very uncomfortable for me sometimes. And so and also like how gentle she was. Like the joke that, you know, Lisa always seems like the softie and Ami seems like the hard one when it's the opposite. That's hilarious, right? Ami was so gentle, and for me to not have ever had that in my life, it was hard for me to accept in a certain kind of way, or not feel that it was a sham or a ploy in a certain kind of way. So there was never a time when I was with Ami where it didn't always feel very intense for me. And I know that she knows that. she always knew that. Like, she could always read me very well, and she was always in this attempt to soothe me. And oftentimes I'm just not soothable. That's just why I'm so, you know, big the way that I am. So that was just something, you know, we've had all this lovely picture of Ami, but her intensity was real. And the reason why she was, you know, she had such a presence that it worked the same way for different reasons, right? So just as much as she could keep people outside of the SWIP session, the APA is just as much as she could keep me holding on just enough for me to get my potential realized, to get me, you know, get me okay. So I just wanted to throw that different light on her presence. Fun fact, anyone who's ever read my work and has seen my bibliographies, which are usually as long as my books, and has seen the degree to which I cite within my text, that is her fault, right? So my very first paper that I gave her on my work on feminist social contract theory, and I was throwing out all these things like feminists say and people know and it has once been said, and she was like, who the fuck said that? And I was like, you know the people. And she was like, who are the fucking people? I was like, they did. And she was like, no. You have to know who says it, and then you have to know all of the people who say it, and then you have to cite all of the people who said that same thing. So that means you have to read everything ever. And so if you ever flip open one of my books, bibliography, like crazy. So that is the fun fact about how she made me a ridiculous kind of philosopher in an annoying sense. Okay.
Thank you, Shay. That's great. Oh. Other thoughts from people? I know sometimes it's hard to say what we're thinking and feeling. Go ahead, Courtney.
I'm sorry to speak twice, but as Ami's current graduate student, there were some really interesting barriers, limitations. I haven't fully processed my experience of being her student, and is an experience. I just wanted to follow up, Shay, what you said. Apparently, Ami's influence on you was to stand behind you, and you felt the flames to your feet, and so you moved. I too have a long history and experience with trauma, which Ami saw the second she met me, as Ami does. What was interesting for me about that experience and working with Ami is that she did the same thing. She stood behind me. She sort of brought up the flame and said, do this, do this, do this. And in typical me fashion, I turned around, looked at her and said, why? And so I'm glad to hear that we can move to the point where it does move our feet. But if you would ever like to discuss what it is to have Ami standing behind you, and all that comes with that, that would be a conversation that I would really appreciate having. Just as a lighter note, one of my favorite experiences with Ami, being the first in my family to go to graduate school, being just the first and really not having any understanding of how philosophy was supposed to work, how graduate school was supposed to work. I knew nothing about professionalism or what was expected of me here. I arrived and had been encouraged in my undergraduate program to develop my own way of thinking, develop my own position in a way that was significantly less literature review and much more my own thought, for better or worse, not commenting on the quality. But one of the things that I did with Ami is I would go to meetings. She would meet with me weekly in a Starbucks. And we were talking about, I don't even know what, one day, but I looked at her and I said, she'd given me some position on whatever, and I looked at her and I said, no, Ami, you're wrong. Let me tell you why. And I did this at the age of 22, having just arrived in grad school, knowing exactly nothing, which she was entirely aware of. And instead of shutting me down, instead of exercising any form of power or control or authority, which she could have, in which I would eventually come to see practiced in the discipline, she just sort of sat back, raised her eyebrows and said, what do you mean? And then she let me talk. It was a profoundly moving experience. It was the only time that I would be able to use that line. Unfortunately, she did not have the foresight to tell me that doing that to other professors anywhere in the discipline was not going to be met with the same sort of response. But for me, it embodied that Ami putting my feet to the fire. It was, okay, you can have the opinion, but you better have something to say and you better be able to back it up. And I don't care if you don't know anything or if you think you know everything. But if you're going to suggest that I'm wrong, do tell me why. Anyway, Shay, if you ever want to talk about what the feet to the fire feels like, I'd be happy to do so.
Saba, go ahead.
Yeah, if anybody else wants to speak up, I can, because I've already spoken. But I was just going to quickly mention that I had both my kids while I was still in grad school, and both Ami and Lisa were super supportive. And I think even at that time, I kind of understood that that was not common practice. But now, especially at that time, it wasn't common practice at all. I think now there's a little bit more awareness in the discipline of philosophy, what it means to support women. But at that time, I knew that that was not the norm. And I had heard horror stories all around, but both Ami and Lisa, who were both on my dissertation committee, were extremely supportive and gave me so much leeway to finish my dissertation at the pace that was working for me, with 2 kids and, living in a joint family and all that good, stuff that happens when you're young. So I'm here because of their grace, essentially.
Other speakers? So Jessica, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm also, I was also a Misrecognition student. And I just would like to say that I think I'm just sort of now really coming to realize how lucky I was. Because during the, 4 years that we worked together, it seemed so easy and so fluid that I took it for granted all the time, in a sense. And yeah, now that I keep remembering our meetings, our conversations, what it was like to be with her. I basically realized how lucky I was all this, and I mean how precious all that time is. Yeah, I mean, I think I was terribly lucky to have me as an advisor, to be I mean, to be sort of in her hands, and so terribly lucky now that I'm able to continue and to finish the dissertation project accompanied by Lisa. So I'm also sure, I also feel that I'm close to finishing this dissertation, basically because Ami was supporting me along all the, and I also came with kids to grad school, and yeah, it's amazing how she was supportive, and how she made it seem, I mean, she made it easier all the time. She made it seem sort of not only, I mean, possible, and how that would be part also of our relationship as an advisor and an advisee. And I'm deeply grateful for that. How she always asked about how the girls were doing, and how deeply she cared for us each time about how we were doing, and caring about such little details. While at the same time, she was also caring about how they work and how I would continue working under all these circumstances. So I basically just wanted to say that I keep realizing how lucky I have been and how lucky I am at the moment also. And thank you very much. Thank you for the day today. It's been wonderful, and it's been wonderful also to have this final time to talk a little bit more about what she meant with us at a more personal level. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. It's been really wonderful for me to have the perspective of her graduate students. I mean, many people have been her students over the years, but having her current graduate students here to give some reflections and talk about her work has been just really wonderful. Diana.
Like I said in the chat, it is really, really hard for me to talk about this. I can barely talk about it, even after all this time. So I'm going to say just a little bit, and sorry for me breaking down like this, but her death just really, really, really was so hard for me. So I did write about it for the Women in Philosophy blog. So for full details, please see my written works, right? Because I just can't talk about it. But I did want to follow up on what Jessica said about, feeling so fortunate and taking for granted at the time that when she was working with me, I mean, one of the things I said in what I wrote for the blog was that I don't know where she found the time. Like, because when I was with her, it was like I was the only person that mattered. And clearly she made everybody feel like that. And I don't know how she did that, but that is a gift that she gave to her students, and that I have tried to, I'm not as good at it as she was, because I don't think anybody could be, but I've tried to emulate that. And I wanted to say also that I also, like Jessica, I mean, I took it for granted that everybody had this kind of a mentor, that everybody had this kind of a dissertation director, and they did not. Very, very few people had that kind of love and support. And I wanted to say to you all that I actually ended up mentoring, for example, through the job market, people who were my fellow grad students who were working with other faculty at Binghamton who didn't give them that support. People who, like Ami prepared me and Lisa for every aspect of the job market. And I remember riding to APA with Ami and Lisa in their car to go and interview, and both of them telling me, this is what you need to do. This is what you need to wear. This is how you, we talked about makeup. And Ami said, Sandra Barkey says, light makeup, but you know, so, but just wear a little bit, right? And I mean, down to that level of detail and care and, you know, like how to present oneself. I didn't know any of these things. I was, you know, one of the first people in my family to go to graduate school. And as I said, I mean, I thought everybody got this, but they did not. And then I had friends who were on the job market who were completely at a loss. And I told them everything I knew from what I had learned from her. So it's just such a, you know, I said in the blog that when she died, it was like, I just couldn't believe it. You know, I couldn't believe she was gone. It's such an enormous loss. And there's so many things I wish I had said to her and been able to talk to her about. So it's just really hard. You know, I just really loved her and I felt loved by her. So thank you for letting me cry and say those words.
Thank you, Diana. Deborah, please go ahead.
Hi there. I am not a philosopher. I'm a retired lobbyist, but I'm also a longtime friend.
Deborah, did you want to speak?
Yeah.
Can you unmute?
I thought I did.
Okay.
You can't hear me?
Okay, gotcha. I hear you now.
Okay.
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, good. So I just wanted to, I've been sort of lurking all day listening to all the presentations. And I just wanted to express my appreciation to the organizers and the presenters for pulling this together. It was really remarkable. The notion of folks organizing a conference built around Ami's work and her ideas and her influence on your lives and your careers, it's just extraordinary. And I was really glad to be able to share in it. I could actually sometimes hear Ami talking when you guys were talking. Shay said something about, I don't know what it was, and she said in a certain kind of way, and I just like practically fell off my chair because Ami would always say in a certain kind of way. So anyway, I just wanted to thank you for sharing everything today. It was great. And I think Ami would have really loved it. She would have been embarrassed, but I think she also would have loved the idea that you all thought so much of her work and her contributions that you would have organized this. I think she would have been overwhelmed. And I wanted to, just one more thing, just to convey to Lisa and Yuval my love, always.
Thank you, Deborah. Lisa, go ahead.
I don't want to say much. It's been really, really wonderful today just to listen to all of the papers and to all of the things that you all have said here. But I do just want to say, especially to all of the present and former graduate students who have talked about Ami, that you know, you are her legacy, you are her intellectual legacy now, and I'm sure she would have been very happy and proud to hear and see what you are doing now, and you know that she and her work and her influence is carrying on through the work that you're still doing now. So I know you all miss her. I do too, of course, and it's nice to see you all together and continuing on from Diana. I was just telling Yuval, there's a picture of you holding Yuval when she was a baby. So that tells me how long ago you were here. And, you know, to those of you who are still here and are still finishing your dissertations. So it's been a long span, and it's great that so many of you are here, and there's several more who aren't here who are also part of that legacy.
Thank you, Lisa. Other thoughts from anyone, or are we winding down? Seems like we might be, okay, Sunny Graff, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I also wanted to express my thanks to everybody who organized this wonderful day. I was only here for the evening part of it. I wasn't able to come during the day, but I would definitely love to be able to, if you have recordings or something like that, if it's accessible, that would be fabulous. I'm actually taking a martial arts test tomorrow, so I was getting ready for that. And I know Ami from Columbus, Ohio, way back in the 70s. And so we were doing martial arts very, very early on together, and continued on. And yeah, what a wonderful woman. It was so nice to hear everybody's tributes to her. I know her, I knew her as this crazy Israeli woman who would wear sandals with socks. I mean, it just, I thought that was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever seen. And I absolutely loved her for doing it. She was never conforming to anything. Yeah, so it was really, really lovely to hear how all of you have known her for really a whole lot longer than I knew her. But we had such an intense time back in the 70s and starting, you know, political radical feminist work. And I definitely grew by knowing her. And yeah, I'm actually kind of jealous when I was listening to all these wonderful stories that I didn't have more time with her. But we, you know, we stayed in contact, and I totally miss her. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sunny. Other thoughts, feelings, memories? So maybe we are winding down. I want to thank again our official presenters for this session, Louis and Anne and Lori. Those were wonderful presentations, and really set up a feeling for the rest of the speakers that could join in and have something to say. So thanks to everybody for being here. I will turn it back over to Shay in case you've got final words for the day.
Yeah. So thanks for coming through. I hope you enjoyed your day with Feast, because this is home, right? Just to say out loud again, 80% of the possibility of this conference is because of Diana Taylor. So literally could not have done this without her. So under no circumstance do I want to take any of the credit. This is her credit. She pulled this off. So Diana, thank you so much. Also, Saba for saving my ass all day today, because I can't computer. So she's really been killing it for me. And the rest of the people, the memorial speakers, we really appreciate you stepping up tonight and taking a little extra time to show some love to Ami. And thanks to Yuval for being here. It was nice to have you. I'm glad that you were nearby. So I think that's all I've got. And it's been a long day, but it's been great. And we will have the recordings and we will post them up. We have, Saba created a YouTube page for us today, finally. So we will put that up on YouTube. We will share that. We will be working on call for papers for special issues with Hypatia and the APA newsletter on women in philosophy. And I think that's all the business that I have right now. Again, remember, call for papers for next year is going to be coming out soon, The Politics of Self-Care in an Unjust World. And we'll be looking for nominees to fill our absent positions on the steering committee. Got it. And pay your dues.